Okay, now I'm recording. So I'll say again for anyone listening to the recorded lecture that the first metaphysics exercise is now up, and also to remind you that the second live lecture this week will be tomorrow instead of Wednesday. Okay, are there any questions about anything like that? I thought I turned that off. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about today is mechanism. So I'll write that here. Oops. We're getting the bugs out here. Okay, so I mean, mechanism is not a term that, did someone say something? What's this? Yes, the lecture will be recorded as usual. So if, that's why I felt free to just reschedule it, because if you can't make that other time, you can watch the recorded lecture. Are there any other questions? Okay. And so now wait, I don't see the screen share anymore. What happened to it? Okay, there it is. All right, so mechanism is not a term that Locke uses, so you might wonder why I'm talking about it, but I think as soon as I start to say what mechanism is, you'll understand why I'm talking about it in connection with this week's reading. So, so mechanism starts with the idea of a body. So a body is something that takes up or occupies a certain amount of space. Or as we say, it's extended. So in order to do that, to take up or occupy a certain amount of space, it has to have a size, or as Locke often says, bulk, and it has to have a shape or figure. So it has bulk, figure, and it has to have a position, and it has to have rest or motion. That is, it takes up a certain amount of space, which has a certain shape, and it's related by distance and direction to other bodies. And that's its position, right? So Locke always considers position to be relative to other bodies. And those relations to other bodies can either stay the same, that's rest relative to those other bodies, or they can change, and that's motion. So anything that takes up or occupies space, any extended thing, has to have these properties: bulk, figure, position, and rest or motion. And then there's one final thing, which is, what does it mean to take up a space? So it means that no other body can be in that space with it at the same time. That's what Locke and other mechanists take it to mean. So it takes up a space by excluding other bodies by that space, from that space. And Locke will add, although Descartes is basically the only one who doesn't want to add this, that it excludes other bodies because it has a certain power by which it resists the motion of other bodies. And that power by which it resists other bodies coming into its space is the quality of solidity. And that power also explains, according to Locke and other mechanists, except again for Descartes, how one body can act on another body. The way one body can act on another body, or I guess I should say, has to be able to act on another body, right? Like, what belongs to the very nature of something that takes up its space in this way, that allows it to act on something else, is that if we have body A moving into the space that's occupied by body B, then since body B absolutely resists any other body being in its space, either this motion has to stop, meaning that A will come to rest, or B has to start moving. And this power of bodies to stop or start other bodies in motion is this way that they act on each other is called impulse. Okay, so far that's about kind of like the minimum requirements to be a body. To be a body, you must have bulk, figure, position, rest or motion, and solidity. And that means you must be able to stop or move other bodies by impulse. But mechanism is the doctrine, the philosophical view, that these are the only properties that are really in bodies. And these are the properties that Locke is going to call primary qualities. So mechanism is the philosophical view that the properties that bodies actually have are only the minimum properties that you must have to be a body. And therefore, the ways bodies can act on each other is only by impulse. And what about those other properties that we tend to attribute to bodies, like color, taste, smell, sound is sometimes listed here, although I don't think we really tend to say that a body has a sound, it makes a sound, but I don't know. Anyway, color, taste, smell, sound, and heat or cold. All of those things, according to mechanists, are not really in the bodies. They're really in us somehow. They have to do with our sensations, and we, in some sense, mistakenly attribute them to the bodies. So that's the doctrine of mechanism. It's called mechanism because everything gets explained like a machine, like gears pushing against each other. Every way that bodies act on each other has to come down to this. However, there's two questions that's raised by this definition of mechanism. So one is, what does it mean? And what do I mean by what does it mean? In what sense are these properties really in the bodies? And in what sense are the other properties really or only in us? So that's one question. And another question is, why should we believe it? Right? Once you explain what the mechanists mean by saying that only these properties are really in bodies and the other ones are that we think are in bodies are only in us, why think that's true? So, and the reason I separate these questions out this way is that, so almost all early modern philosophers, well, maybe I shouldn't say that. Let me say this at least. Galileo, Descartes, and Locke are all mechanists. So are a lot of other early modern philosophers, such as Hobbes, Spinoza, Leibniz, sort of. They're all mechanists, but they all give somewhat different answers to these two questions. So they agree on maintaining that these are the only properties that are really in bodies. And again, Descartes is the one who would cross solidity off that list. All the others agree with solidity also. But they don't necessarily agree on exactly what it means for a quality to really be in something as opposed to only be in us. And they don't necessarily agree in the reason they would give why we should think this about bodies. Okay, so are there questions about that so far? What happened to my chat window? Now it disappeared again. There was one question, is impulse something like inertia then? No, inertia is about what a body does when nothing is acting on it. Right? So like inertia says that if a body isn't being pushed by another body, then if it's already at rest, it will stay at rest. And if it's already in motion, it will remain in motion. Well, I guess it depends what you mean by inertia. If you mean, as people in this period sometimes do, not just that the body at rest will remain at rest, but that, so to speak, the more of that body there is, right? Like the more massive it is, the harder it will be to get it to change. If you include that in inertia, then it's somehow related to that thing about impulse. But the main point about impulse is just that whether it's hard or easy, right? Because like the diagram I drew didn't say which would happen or whether something intermediate would happen. Right? Like, how do I know? Will A stop? Will A continue moving and B start moving? Will A slow down and B start moving a little bit? Like all kinds of different things can happen here. But what can't happen is for A to keep moving while B stays where it is, because B is going to exclude A from its space. And that's what makes action by impulse supposedly understandable from the very nature of body. We'll see that Hume looks at that carefully and claims that no, you don't really understand that. But that's what's supposed to make it necessary from the very idea of something that takes up space, that it can act on other things that way. And okay, right, that Locke calls these primary qualities. Someone already answered that. Okay. I see, I can't see things that are behind this window. All right, never mind. Okay, so if there are no Oh, do we have a more contemporary word to describe solidity or concept, I guess? I mean, I think solidity is a perfectly normal term. That's what Locke says about it. He says we use it to mean different things, like mathematicians use solid just to mean three-dimensional extension, for example. But he says, yeah, what we usually mean by saying something is solid is that other things can't get into its space. Um, if you mean like, does a property like this play a role in contemporary physics? The answer, I think, is no. We don't believe in solid bodies anymore. Right, a more sciencey word. Yeah. No, I don't think there is a more sciencey. I mean, I'm sure. No, I think there really isn't. Right, what we believe, and what you will already see Kant saying is more like that there are centers of force that um, that centers of repulsive force, that the closer you get to them, the harder it is, right? So like if this is an electron and here I have another electron trying to get here, the closer I go, the harder it will be. But there's no absolute limit around this center from which other electrons are excluded. So there's no such thing as absolute solidity. I mean, I'm leaving aside quantum mechanics, just uh, right. Um, so, so therefore, we don't really believe in bodies in this sense anymore. Okay, but getting back to what Locke believes, right? So, so let me start with Locke's answer to one. What does it mean to say that the primary qualities? And I realized before that in the recording you can really hear it when I step on these floorboards that creak. But I don't know what to do about that. Well, you're just going to have to hear creaking, I guess, because I can't stand. All right. So what does Locke mean when he says that primary qualities are really in the bodies and secondary qualities are really only in us? Well, in a sense, Locke thinks that both primary and secondary qualities are in the body. So let me erase this. Yeah, I'll erase this. I might have to write some of that stuff up again later. But if you remember the picture from last time, that here's the operation of perception. Here's my mind. Here's the idea, which is the immediate object. And I said, what's the mediate object? Well, Locke calls that a quality. And the quality is a power that's in this external thing. In the case of perception, what I'm perceiving is some body, perceiving the qualities of some body. And the quality is a power in the body that causes me to perceive that idea. So by this definition of quality, which we actually saw in today's reading, where he distinguishes between quality and idea, by this definition of quality, primary and secondary qualities are both in the body because by definition, the quality is in the body. So in what sense, nevertheless, does Locke think that only primary qualities are really in the body and secondary qualities are not? So the answer is I think, that primary qualities are real qualities and secondary qualities regarded as qualities in the body are let me go back. Both primary and secondary qualities are a power that's in the body, namely a power to cause a certain perception in me. But primary qualities are real powers. Whereas secondary qualities are bare powers. So what do I mean by that? Well, actually, maybe before I explain what I mean by that, I should say, okay, no, let me stick with that now. So primary qualities are real powers and secondary qualities are bare powers. What does that mean? Well, real, as I always emphasize in almost every class, real comes from the Latin word res, which means thing. So real means like thingle. And a real power is a power that something has because of something that's in it. So the power and the rest of the thing that has the power, in some sense, are separable from each other. You can count one thing and another thing. That's what it means that it's a real power. A real power is a power that has its basis in a separate little thing that is the power. Whereas a bare power is a power where, so we can say, like, in the case of a real power, you have the thing that has the power, and you have this little thing that is the power, and because this big thing has this little thing, that's why it has this power. Whereas in the case of a bare power, there's just one thing that has the power, and there's no little thing that is the power. Is that kind of clear so far? Do you have a question about that before I go on? Is there an example? Well, I'm about to give a kind of example from Locke's point of view, where the examples are the primary qualities versus the secondary qualities. But that example, as it turns out, is really abstract and hard to understand. So let me talk about like an earlier view, like what William of Ockham thought about this. So William of Ockham thought almost the reverse of what Locke is going to say, that if something looks white to me, that has the power to cause the sensation of whiteness in me, it's because it has an accident of whiteness, right? So like in a snowball, there's a thing that's different from the snowball itself that's called its accident of whiteness. This is not what Locke thinks, right? This is William of Ockham. So William of Ockham says when something looks white, it's because there's this little thing in it, the whiteness. And it's by virtue of having this whiteness in it that it's able to cause the white sensation in me. Whereas on the other hand, if you talk about figure, William of Ockham says in that case, it's not a real quality. He says there isn't something else in the snowball that is its figure. The snowball, um, uh, it's just the disposition of parts that make up the snowball also includes its shape. So that would be an example. I don't know if you find that example at all. Well, I know. I started off this by saying that I'm going to talk about William of Ockham. Someone says I thought it was the opposite way around. And that's why I started this off by saying I'm going to talk about William of Ockham, who thinks almost the exact opposite of Locke about this. So you're right. According to Locke, it's the other way around. But I think it's a little bit easier to understand. I don't know. Maybe what I get by easier to understand, I lose by confusion of discussing two opposite views at once, right? But I think it's a little bit easier to understand what William of Ockham is thinking. He's thinking whiteness. I mean, of course, it's not really floating in the surface of the snowball somewhere, right? You can't really like take it out and have it separately. But somehow, like, whiteness is not the same thing as the snowball. It's a property that it has. So, right, so that would be an example. That's like the medieval nominalists, the way they wanted to restrict real powers. So from Locke's point of view, I'm about to talk about an example from Locke's point of view. Okay. But before I talk about the example from Locke's point of view, I want to mention one other thing, and Locke says both of these, I think, but he spends a lot more time talking about this second one. In what sense is it that the primary qualities are really in bodies, but the secondary qualities are not? Locke says, well, the primary qualities resemble our ideas of them. But the secondary qualities, yes, there is a quality in the body that you can call its whiteness that causes me to perceive white in it, but that quality of whiteness doesn't resemble my idea. So that's the second way that Locke has of explaining why the primary qualities are really in the body and the secondary qualities are not. There is a quality in the body, but it's not the quality we think it is. It doesn't resemble our idea. Whereas in the case of primary qualities, the idea that's in the body is the very idea that we perceive in the body. That is, the quality that's in the body resembles the idea that we immediately perceive. What was the first? You mean what was the first way? Right, the first way was this. The first way, this is all the answer to that first question. What do you mean by saying that the properties that bodies really have are the primary qualities? Bulk, figure, position, etc. Right? What do you mean by saying that? So I'm saying Locke has two answers to that. I'm going to try to explain how they go together, but I'm first introducing them separately. Locke has two answers to that. One answer is, well, in the case of primary qualities, not only does the body have a power to cause the primary quality, but that power is something real in the body. Whereas in the case of secondary qualities, the body has a power to cause us to perceive the idea, but that power is not a separate thing that exists out there. It's just a power that one thing, the body, has. I know it's really hard to understand either of those alternatives. I hope that I can make it a little bit clearer when I try to explain how it goes together with the other distinction. The other distinction, right, well, so there's only those primary, someone asked, so for example, what would the primary quality of snow be? So there's only those primary qualities: bulk, figure, position, motion, rest, and solidity. And he also adds number, although that's not exactly the same as the others. So it's not like snow has one primary quality and something else has another primary quality. This means that all bodies share the same types of qualities. So how does a snowball differ from a cotton ball? You might think it's because one has cold in it and the other has heat. They're just physical qualities. Well, physical, so someone says, so primary things, I guess you mean primary qualities are just physical qualities. Right, but the question is, what physical qualities are they? Right, it's physical quality is not, physical quality means a quality that natural things have. All right, okay, so let me explain. So you might think the difference between a cotton ball and a snowball would be that the snowball has cold in it and the cotton ball has a mixed temperature. Mixed, actually temperature means mixture, but anyway, the snowball has like neither extremely hot nor extremely cold qualities. So they differ in qualities of heat versus cold. All right, I chose two things that are the same color, so I'm not going to talk about color right away. So you might think that's the difference, but according to mechanism, that can't be the difference. Why? Because heat and cold are not really in bodies. So the difference must have to do with the bulk, figure, position, and motion and rest of the small parts of the snowball versus the small parts of the cotton ball. And that's what you'll see Locke saying over and over, right? So if you could see small enough into the snowball, you would see, and Locke already says something that's a distant relative of what we think about this, that if you look in the snowball, you'll see that the small pieces are not moving very fast relative to each other. Whereas you'll see in the cotton ball, they're moving faster relative to each other. That's the real difference between them. But that difference causes us to perceive one as cold and the other as warm. Okay, there were a bunch of questions while I was saying that. Right, so someone said we think the snowball is white, but the snowball simply causes the feeling of whiteness without necessarily being white. Well, anyway, there's nothing in the snowball, in this way of looking at it, there's nothing in the snowball that is its whiteness. All there is in the snowball is small pieces moving relative to each other of different shapes. There's nothing in there that is its whiteness. And moreover, the other way of looking at it, there's nothing, whiteness is a name for an idea in me, the idea of white. There's something in the snowball that I can call the quality of whiteness, namely its power to cause me to perceive that idea, but that's something that's in the snowball doesn't resemble my idea of whiteness. Okay, is that a little bit clearer? There was one question that I'm not answering because I'm about to go on and talk about it. All right, and so like the first one is hard to understand because it's really abstract. I mean, I hope from what I said about the snowball, you can sort of get the idea, right? Again, that if you look at what's really in the snowball, all you find are little pieces moving around. That's all that could be in there. But so there can't be an extra thing in there that's its whiteness. Okay, so someone asked this. So the real difference in a cotton ball versus snowball is in the movement of molecules, but what that results in, colder versus room temperature, that's a secondary quality. Well, see, I mean, it would be nice if that were right, but it's actually just a little bit wrong, and yet it's confusing because Locke himself sometimes talks in the way that's a little bit wrong. Strictly speaking, and if you look at those sections where Locke introduces the distinction, you'll see that this is what he's saying, but then he in advance apologizes that he's not always going to stick with this. Strictly speaking, quality is a name for what's in the body. So what we really should say is whiteness is an idea in me. There's a quality in the body that produces it, but it's not exactly right to call that quality whiteness because it doesn't resemble the idea. Whereas in the case of figure, like spherical, so there's an idea of sphericity in me, and there's a quality in the body by which it causes me to perceive that idea of sphericity. But in this case, the idea and the quality resemble each other. So in that case, it's like, it makes more sense to call them both the same name, but to say this is the idea of sphericity and this is the quality of sphericity because they resemble each other. Did that help? Okay. So, okay, let me start again what I was going to say. So this distinction is harder to understand, whereas the other one, which is the distinction between resemblance and no resemblance. This seems easier to understand, right? Like, oh, he's saying there isn't any, that my idea is white, but there isn't anything white in the snowball. But of course, and someone asked a question like this, like, by what criterion can we tell whether they resemble each other? We obviously can't do it by looking at the idea and then looking at the quality and seeing if they resemble each other. Because looking at a quality means the quality causes you to perceive an idea, right? That's what looking at a quality is. You can't look at it straight without the idea. If it were an immediate object, then it would be an idea. That, by the way, I think, helps get us ready for Berkeley. Berkeley is going to say the snowball is the immediate object of my perception, and therefore snowballs are ideas. But again, Locke doesn't want to say that, right? So Locke wants to say that the snowball and all its properties, all its powers are outside of me, outside of my mind, but I only perceive them because of something in my mind that is the immediate object. And therefore I can never like get around this idea and look at the quality directly. That doesn't make sense. So, so how can Locke so much as talk about some ideas resembling their objects and others not? And I think like this is kind of the first place where one answer that people give to that question is, well, it really doesn't make any sense. This, I think, for example, is definitely what Berkeley thinks about Locke. It really doesn't make any sense at all, but Locke is just not that bright. So he didn't notice that it didn't make that much sense. And that's the answer. Now, I mean, is that plausible? Like I just started talking about this here to a bunch of undergraduates who had never read Locke before, and right away someone asked this question. Is it plausible that Locke worked on this book for years and he didn't notice that this was a problem? I mean, maybe. I guess stranger things have happened, but it would be nice to find a better explanation than that. So I think the explanation is connected to something that Locke isn't going to say explicitly for a long, long time, until book 4. But I'm going to show it to you now. Now I'm going to try to literally show it to you because I got my document camera now. But I don't know how well this is going to work. So first we'll switch to me. And then, oops. Spotlight, me. And then I have to change cameras to document camera. Yay. So this is on page 485. Now, is this readable? Someone want to say whether it's readable or not? Is that better? Okay. Some few of the primary qualities have a necessary dependence and visible connection one with another, as figure necessarily supposes extension. Receiving or communicating motion by impulse supposes solidity. That is, the primary qualities, or sorry, the ideas of primary qualities is what you really have to be talking about here. And again, this is one of the places where, as Locke warns in advance, he's not going to keep that distinction straight as he should. The ideas of primary qualities show a necessary dependence and visible connection one with another. So somehow, now let me switch back. Unfortunately, the reason it has to be done in such a complicated way is that you can't have two secondary cameras. At least I haven't figured out how to do that. So you can switch between, I can switch between me and this, but I can't switch between me, this, and the document camera. Okay, but so this is what he's saying. And by the way, that was in book 4, chapter 3, section 14. So we're not going to get to that for a while, but I think it's helpful in understanding what's going on here. So in the case of the ideas of primary qualities, somehow, this is kind of mysterious, and this is exactly what Hume is going to say is impossible and absurd, but this is what Locke is claiming. Somehow, by perceiving this one idea, I see that it's necessarily connected to another idea that I'm not perceiving right now. Or, I mean, maybe I am perceiving it right now, but if I'm perceiving them both right now, I can see that they have to go together and I couldn't take one away without the other. Something like that. And remember the examples, there were 2 examples. Figure necessarily supposes extension, and receiving or communicating motion by impulse supposes solidity. So, right, so among the ideas that are somehow necessarily connected are the idea of solidity and the idea of one body moving another body by impulse. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when I feel that sensation that is my idea of solidity, I know that whatever thing has the power to cause that sensation of solidity in me, well, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. I know that whenever I have this sensation of solidity, so something has caused me to have it, I can also be caused to have the sensation of one body moving another by impulse. So there's an example of how primary qualities, according to Locke, the ideas of primary qualities show necessary connections one with another. They have visible necessary connections, whereas that doesn't apply to secondary qualities, according to Locke. that is to the ideas of secondary qualities. I know why Locke slips up on this because it's so hard to keep it up, right? The ideas of secondary qualities don't show necessary connections one to another, whereas the ideas of primary qualities do. What does this have to do with either this or this? And I think the answer is, so let me now draw two. So this is the idea of a certain power in some external object. Could be the idea of solidity or figure or whatever. It has a necessary connection to some other idea, meaning since I've been caused to perceive, since I've perceived this idea, I know I also can perceive this idea. Or it could be a lot more complicated than that, but it's some kind of, based on this idea, I can predict in what way I'll have certain other ideas of primary qualities. They're necessarily connected. Now, what that means, of course, if I do perceive this other idea, there will have to be, so this quality caused that act of perception. If I do perceive this other idea, there will have to be an act of perception of that idea. And that act of perception is also caused by some quality in the external thing. But I know that if I perceive this one, I can also perceive this one. And that means I know that if this power is there, this power is also there. Right? Because these couldn't be necessarily connected unless these were necessarily connected. So this is what's special about the idea of the primary qualities, I think, according to Locke. And again, I don't know, except that one passage in way into book 4, a place where he explains this clearly, but I think that's what's special about them. And now you can see two different things, resemblance versus no resemblance. So resemblance here doesn't mean they look the same. Right? They look kind of similar if you squint or something like that. It means they have an analogous structure. And that indeed is something that resemblance can mean as a technical term. And I think that's what Locke means by it. Right? So like, as this idea is to this idea, this power is to this power. Right? That's what's called an analogy. A is to B as C is to D. And here A and B would be the two ideas and C and D would be the two powers. And so by knowing that there's these two ideas with a necessary connection between them, I also know there's two powers with a necessary connection between them. And so I know like the structure of my ideas mirrors some structure in the object. They follow each other, and that's the resemblance. Whereas if I have an idea and I don't see any reason why, and if I have two ideas and I don't see any reason why they have to occur together or apart, I don't learn anything about the structure of powers in the body from that. So, right, so here's an example. Now I'm finally going to give an example that I think Locke would agree with, but as I said, it's going to be kind of abstract. As Locke says later on, I won't show you this on the document camera, but this is in book 2, chapter 13, section 6. for the mind having a power to repeat the idea of any length, or else to join it to another with what inclination it will, and so make what sort of angle it pleases, ... It can do that till it has wholly enclosed any space. So that's Locke's explanation in book 13 of how we get the ideas of different figures. The idea of a particular figure, it turns out, is not a simple idea. It's a complex idea. And it's a complex idea in just the way you might think. It's composed of ideas of different lengths joined to each other at different angles. So, and Locke is saying the mind has an ability to join these ideas of lengths to each other at whatever angle it wants. And it can keep doing that until it's enclosed to space. And in that way, it can form the ideas of many different possible shapes without ever having to observe that particular shape. Okay, so that's the explanation coming up in chapter 13 of how we get the idea of different figures. But there's something important to notice about this. The mind can join these lengths at whatever angle it wants, but it doesn't necessarily mean it can enclose a space by attaching lengths to each other at whatever angle it wants, right? I mean, in particular, just by joining two lengths, it can never enclose a space. This in Euclidean geometry is a consequence of what's called the parallel postulate, but never mind that exactly now. The point is, like, at least the way we normally think about shape, you can attach this second segment to the first one however you want, and you never will get a closed figure. You need at least three. So there have to be at least three. And you can say more about them. For example, the third one always has to be shorter than the sum of the other two. Right, so there's actually a lot of constraints on how the mind can put these different lengths together. And Locke's explanation, how do we know that there are those constraints, is going to be, I believe, that same thing he says way further on in book 4. We know that there are these constraints because there's necessary relationships that are visible in the ideas themselves. So in perceiving the idea of this length, and the idea of this length, and the idea of this angle, and this angle, and whatever, we see necessarily that the space can't be closed unless there are at least three of them, and etc. So far we're talking all about ideas here, right? It's something the mind can do. I may never have seen a triangle, but Locke says I can form the idea of a triangle from simple ideas of length and angle, I guess. He never talks about ideas of angle, but anyway, that I got from my experience, right? So we're talking all about ideas here, but now notice that these necessary relationships between these ideas, again, imply necessary relationships between the powers to cause the perception of them. So from this fact that it takes three of these ideas to enclose a space necessarily, I know whatever it is in body that causes me to perceive a segment of a certain length, I know something about how those powers have to be related to each other necessarily. So I can't say, and it doesn't even make sense to say, there's something in the external thing that looks just like my idea of a triangle. Looking like a triangle just means making me perceive this idea. But what I can say is, there's a one-to-one correspondence between certain things in my idea and certain things in the external object. I just realized my chat window disappeared again, and there's probably lots of questions that I've missed. Let me bring that back. Is he saying one perceived idea predicts the other perception, or is he saying it actually caused the other perception? No, so that's the key point, that according to Locke, ideas don't cause other ideas. Qualities cause ideas. either qualities of external bodies or operations of my mind. Those what cause, well, I mean, they cause the perception of ideas, thereby, I guess they do both, right? He says they introduce the idea into the mind and they cause it to perceive it. So ideas by themselves don't do anything. They just sit there and I perceive them. What causes the perception, what brings my passive faculty of perception into act is the external thing, according to Locke. And that's exactly, again, why I can learn something about the external thing, because this necessity can't be due to the fact that this idea caused this idea. It has to be due to the fact that what caused this idea is somehow necessarily related to what caused this one. So that was a good question, but that's the answer to it. Now, someone asked why 3. I'm not sure. You understand why you need at least 3 lines to. So an idea lets us perceive. Well, again, I think the way Locke describes it, strictly speaking, is this. The external body causes us to perceive the idea. And that means both that it somehow introduces the idea to our mind because we couldn't have come up with it ourselves. If it's a simple idea anyway, we couldn't have come up with it ourselves. So the external body somehow introduces it into our mind and it causes this operation of our mind, perception. Okay, but the question, oh, is he saying I can't help but see solidity with, you don't see solidity, you feel solidity, right? I mean, maybe strictly speaking, you feel motion too. I'll talk about that later, about tangible versus visible qualities someday. But yeah, so, well, like I said, the simple type of example will be when you perceive idea so-and-so, you must always at the same time perceive some other idea, right? That would be like the relationship between extension and figure. You never see something that has a shape unless it takes up space, and vice versa. But in a lot of these cases, the relationship is something much more complicated. But like in the case of solidity and motion by impulse, it's like you never feel solidity in something unless that thing would resist the motion of anything else into it. That is, could communicate motion by impulse. So you may be feeling its solidity. I mean, I guess it is always acting on your sense organ when that happens. Maybe this is a better example of something more complicated, right? Where it's like when you see that segment, you know that it could only be combined with other segments to enclose a space in a certain way. It doesn't mean that you necessarily see that way of enclosing a space, but it means you know it limits the possibilities of other ideas you could perceive. Is that right? So necessary connection in a looser sense means like limiting the possibilities for other ideas. Does that help? I'm not sure. Yes, okay. And I think also from that very example, you can see sort of what he's thinking about this, namely that, you know, like, how do we know how many different things there are in the same external thing? It's the same thing. So what do you mean with counting how many different things there are in it? I think what it means here is that we're seeing how complex of a structure it has. Right? So the fact that there's a one-to-one correspondence between this three-partness of my idea and something in the object means that the object has 3 parts. in some sense of part. It has three powers that are related to each other in an analogous way as the parts of my idea are related to each other. So that's why I'm saying these two things actually end up meaning basically the same thing according to Locke. The resemblance means that the external thing has a structure analogous to the structure of my ideas. And real power means that the exact power that I associate with this one idea is something I can count and distinguish from the other powers. So that's the example of a primary quality versus like an example of a secondary quality would be like the redness and raspberry taste of a raspberry. Let me redraw this again. Let's get this out of here. This is confusing. So now here's these two operations of perception. This is the idea of red. This is the idea of raspberry taste. Now, I know that they happen to have been caused at the same time. So I know there's something out here that caused this one, and I know there's something out here that caused this one. But I don't know any kind of necessary relation between these. So I don't know any kind of necessary relation between these. Now, so far you might think something like, well, at least I know there's two of them. But I think the point is that without that one-to-one correspondence, I can't even say that. For all I know, these are the same power. Or rather, I'm not in a position to count this kind of power at all. Might be a better way to put it. Right? I can't count them because all I can count is my own ideas. And unless I have something to like project the structure of my own ideas onto the object, I can't count anything in the object. And that's why these powers are bare powers, must be bare powers. There are primary qualities in the object. There must be primary qualities in the object. Those primary qualities have to somehow explain this red power and this raspberry taste power. But I don't know whether I could separate out the aspects of the primary qualities that cause one from the aspects that cause the other. It could be the same shape, bulk, motion, etc. of the small parts that causes, by affecting my eye, causes me to see red, and by affecting my tongue causes me to taste the raspberry taste. So that's the sense in which these are bare powers. I can't count them as separate little things within the thing. Are there more questions about that so far? Because, all right, so there's two more things I want to talk about. But I know I'm going to have to budget my time. It's already 6:25. Okay, so I guess, so I'm just going to try to compare these two texts. So now I'm going to try to switch back to the document camera. Well, I guess, no, maybe I should ask this later as a poll or something. Whether you find this document camera thing useful or not. But for now, I'm going to try it again. So I switch to this, and then I switch video to this. And there's that. So these are both in chapter 4 of book 2, which is the chapter about solidity. So the first one says, this is on page 124. Oh, it's up at the top of 124. No, it's not. Oh, I'm on the wrong page. It's page 121. No wonder. All right. Okay, so the first thing he says about solidity is that it's the idea that arises from the resistance which we find in body to the entrance of any other body into the place it possesses till it has left it. Right? So that's exactly the same thing I was saying about solidity before. The quality of solidity, we must be talking about, well, so that's what's confusing. This is how it starts. The idea of solidity we receive by our touch, and it arises from the resistance which we find in body to the entrance of any other body into the place it possesses till it has left it. So the quality of solidity is the quality which bodies have by which they resist the motion of any other body into their place until they have left it. And the idea of solidity, Locke is saying in this sentence, is the idea that arises from that quality. So, what did I do? So, now we still have my mind here. We have the idea of solidity. And out here, we have the quality of solidity. So the quality of solidity, actually, we know two things about it. Number one, the idea of solidity arises from it. That is, it's what causes me to perceive the idea of solidity. But number two, we know the quality of solidity is the power this body has to resist any other body from entering into its space. And then here's the other thing he says about solidity. So this is on page 128, chapter 4, section 6. If anyone asks me what this solidity is, I send him to his senses to inform him. Let him put a flint or a football between his hands and then endeavor to join them, and he will know. Right? Why is he saying that? He's saying that because it's a simple idea. He can't tell me what it is by defining it. We'll see him discussing definition at length later on, but you can easily understand what he basically thinks about it. I could define a complex idea by telling you what ideas are parts of it. But a simple idea, I can't tell you what it is. The only thing I can do is send you to your senses, right? So if you ask what is red, I can point to something red, and I say that is red. And you look at it, and hopefully it causes you to perceive the same idea that I perceive, and now you know which idea I associate the word red with. So Locke is saying solidity is like that. I can't tell you what solidity is. If you want to know what it is, do this and you'll feel it. Put something between your two hands, try to push them together. I think this is actually his answer to an argument in Descartes. One reason Descartes says solidity is not a quality, is not a primary quality, I mean, using Locke's terminology, is that if bodies always moved away from me whenever I moved towards them, I wouldn't feel it. But Locke says, aha, but what if I put it between both hands? Now it can't get away. So anyway, so put both my hands around something, try to move them together, and I will perceive this idea. So there seems to be something weird about this, because the first sentence, it seemed like he did tell us what solidity was. Solidity is the idea that arises from the power that every body has of resisting the entrance of any other body into its space until it has left it. And then at the end of the chapter, he says, if you ask me what solidity is, I can't tell you. So I think the answer is, and this is really, I think is really important. The answer is, solidity is a simple idea. I can't tell you what that idea is like unless you have it. But I can tell you what other idea it's necessarily connected to. So it's necessarily connected to communication of motion by impulse, which, as I mentioned before, is the same as stopping motion, right? It's just both ways. It means another body can't be in the same space with this body. I'm not defining the idea of solidity when I tell you that, because the idea of solidity is simple. It doesn't contain this other idea in it. But even though it doesn't contain this idea, it necessarily implies it. And that's what's so special about the idea of solidity. And that's what allows solidity, that's what allows us to know that solidity is essential to bodies. And it allows solidity to be the quality that fills space and takes up space. That's all based on the fact that even though it's just as simple an idea as red, so in and of itself, it's indefinable, it contains this necessary connection to something else, according to Locke. And again, this is exactly where Hume is going to stick at this. But what I'm not sure is whether Hume realizes that Locke is explicitly maintaining this, or whether he kind of, again, thinks Locke is not that bright and hasn't noticed it. But I think Locke is explicitly maintaining this, that certain particular ideas have this necessary connection to other ideas. This is an example of what Kant would call synthetic a priori. And Hume is going to say, no, that doesn't make sense. If they're simple, how could I see anything else in them, like a necessary connection to another idea? Okay. Are there questions about that? Because I haven't discussed abstraction yet, and I really don't want to leave no time for abstraction, which is what usually happens in this lecture. Okay, so now to get out of this, I first switch the camera back, and then I share the other camera, and then I bring the chat window back. It's not that hard once I get used to it. All right, so I'm going to erase all of this and talk about abstraction now. Because that was also included in today's reading. Let's see how much time I have left. 20 minutes. All right. Okay, so what is abstraction? So it has something to do with separating, or as I mentioned before, right, the word abstract is like the word subtract. It means taking off. So it's somehow about separating the characteristics, some characteristics of a certain thing from others. So for example, here's two particular things. This is Beezer, and this is Brandy. And Beezer and Brandy are my brother's two parrots. So Beezer and Brandy are not, well, they're not identical to each other in the sense that they're not numerically identical, right? There's two of them. They're not the same as each other, but they're also not absolutely similar to each other. Beezer has certain characteristics that Brandy doesn't. I think Beezer is bigger, for example, if I'm remembering correctly. Well, I guess I drew it the other way around. So let's say Brandy is bigger, right? So Brandy is bigger than Beezer. Brandy, they're both green, but they're not exactly the same shade of green. They don't sound exactly the same, etc. Right? There's a lot of characteristics they don't share. But nevertheless, the idea of parrot is an idea of both Beezer and Brandy. So what does that mean? I mean, we're not talking about perception anymore, obviously. We're talking about a more complicated mental operation, but somehow or other, the mind call this operation conception by way of this abstract idea of parrot. The mind can have, or does have, I guess can have either or both of them as its external object. So I can think either Beezer or Brandy or both of them together or all parrots together. I can represent them all using this one abstract idea of parrot. And it's because somehow the idea of parrots it refers to the qualities that all parrots have in common. And therefore it contains the ideas that all ideas of parrots have in common. So in order to form this abstract idea, I had to take some concrete idea, or as Locke calls it, particular. So this is an abstract idea. I shouldn't draw this on the same line. That's really confusing. This is confusing too. Call this operation conception. I don't know that Locke ever calls it that, but it's a good name for it. Sometimes he calls it thought, but he also uses thought in a much broader significance, so that's no good. But here's the operation of perception. So the operation of perception in the operation of perception, Brandy, for example, was represented by a particular idea. To form the abstract idea from this particular idea, I had to separate out, and obviously I didn't separate out the actual qualities of Brandy, right? Like I didn't take Brandy apart into a parrot part and a bigger part or something, right? There was no separation here. The separation was in here, right? I separated this particular idea into two parts. One of them went to make up the abstract idea of parrot, and the other part, which contains the characteristics that are specific to Brandy, I'm just discarding. That's the part I'm abstracting from, as they say. Okay, so far so good. But that's what abstraction is supposed to be like. And here's the way Locke explains it. This is book 2, chapter 11, section 9, page 155. 55? Starting here, the mind makes the particular ideas received from particular objects to become general, which is done by considering them as they are in the mind such appearances, separate from all other existences and the circumstances of real existence as time, place, or any other concomitant ideas. So in the, okay, you can't see me now. This is irritating. So in this particular idea of brandy, there were a bunch of simple ideas that are different from each other. And also, another thing about that particular idea is that I had it at a particular place at a particular time. It's not the same as an idea, even an idea I'd have at brandy at a different place at a different time. It's that idea that's at that place and that time. So Locke says that to form the general idea, this is, I understand this as meaning that there's two parts to this. Number one, considering them as they are in the mind, such appearances separate from all other existences. So I look at those simple ideas as what they are, namely simple ideas that could exist without any of the others. They're just what they are themselves, those simple ideas. I'm making gestures with my hands you can't see, but and number two, and the circumstances of real existence as time, place, or any other concomitant ideas. So I separate the simple ideas from each other. I look at them each as what they are by themselves. And I also separate each one of them from the circumstances of space and time at which I'm actually perceiving it. Okay, so why am I emphasizing that detail about it? Well, did I drop another pen? No, it's there. Okay. What I was trying to explain last time, and maybe it wasn't that clear, but I hope now in this context it might be clearer. Why is it that I'm able to do that at all? It's because, in a way, the sense organs have already done a kind of abstraction for me. Right? Brandy, in brandy, I think brandy is a her, but I'm not sure. I don't remember which one is. All right, anyway, so in brandy herself, let's say it's her, in brandy herself, the color and warmth and so on and so forth are inextricably linked with each other. That is, I can't just take the color out and leave the rest of it. These are all powers of one body. They could be primary qualities, in which case I can kind of count them separately, or they can be secondary qualities, in which case I can't even do that. But one way or the other, they're just powers of that body. They can't exist without it or without each other. So in the body itself, they're inextricably linked, as Locke says when he first discusses this. But between the body and my idea, my sense organs are separating out the different qualities by the different ideas that they cause me to perceive. So let me actually switch back to other thing. This is a passage I was reading last time on page 121. Though the qualities that affect our senses are, in the things themselves, so united and blended, that there is no separation, no distance between them. Yet 'tis plain, the ideas they produce in the mind enter by the senses simple and unmixed. And then he goes on to discuss a special case of sense and touch. But actually, I think thinking about the special case is more confusing than otherwise. It's easier to think about the normal case where we're talking about ideas that come in by two different senses, like the whiteness and the coldness of the snowball. So in the snowball itself, whiteness and coldness are so blended that there's no distance between them and they can't be taken apart, etc. But because of the special delicate construction of my sense organs, I have one organ that only responds to a certain power that the snowball has. I have an organ in my skin that only responds to the speed of motion of its little pieces, according to Locke. Or anyway, he thinks that's a probable theory of what heat and cold are. Meanwhile, in my eye, I have another organ that only responds to the shape, figure, and motion of certain particles that the snowball emits and that hit the back of my eye. So, and one of those organs is somehow or other connected to my mind in such a way that it causes me to perceive the idea of coldness. And the other organ is somehow connected to my mind in such a way that it causes me to perceive the idea of whiteness. Or going back to brandy, let's say it's greenness and warmth, right? So even though greenness and warmth are so blended in brandy that I can't take them apart, they enter the mind simple as and unmixed. Greenness is one simple idea, and warmth is a different simple idea. So now you might say, wait, doesn't that mean we've already carried out abstraction? Well, someone asked, is it caused by the same quality or a different one? Well, I mean, because what I was claiming before, although again, I don't know that Locke ever says this explicitly, that in the case of secondary qualities, you can't quite ask that question. Whether the greenness idea is caused by the same quality as the warmth idea. Or I guess maybe you could only answer that question if you could replace them by a description of the primary qualities that are really in the body that are causing these different effects. Is it the same primary qualities or different ones? It could be the same ones, it could be different ones. It doesn't matter for these purposes. The point is, there's certainly things that are green and not warm, and that are warm and not green. So it's possible for something to be able to affect my sense organ in this particular way without affecting the other sense organ, and vice versa. So whether in the parrot they're the same quality or not doesn't matter exactly. I don't know if that was a good answer, but anyway, that's all I have time to answer because there's only 3 minutes left and I want to get to the punchline here, which is, so you might say, well, you've already abstracted. And that's why I said last time, in a way, the abstraction is performed by my body, by the sense organs, before anything gets to my mind. And I think Locke thinks that's true. And that's why, again, when he talks about this, he says that the way particular ideas become general is by considering them as they are in the mind, such appearances, separate from all other existences. That is, the process of abstraction consists in noticing the fact that these are different simple ideas, and then considering one without the other. So the kind of trajectory of an idea in the human mind, I think, works like this. At first, we receive a confused particular idea of something. So it's confused in the sense that there's many different simple ideas, but we haven't separated them out and noticed that they're different. And we also haven't separated them out from the particular time and place at which we received them. And the first step actually is the one he describes here as discernment, is to notice that there's different simple ideas in it. And then if we want, we can put them back together into a clear particular idea of this particular thing. Right? So like that's the difference between the baby's first impression of its mother when it senses all the different effects of its mother, but it doesn't have a clear, complex, particular idea of its mother. To do that, it has to first separate them and then put them back together itself. Intend them to go together as parts of one complex idea. And then once you have that, so really the steps are, number one, you have the confused particular idea. Number two, you have the clear, complex particular idea. And then once you can do that, once you have that, then you can perform the further operation of abstraction, which means considering some of these simple ideas without the others. So that's why, even though this is a puzzle I mentioned last time, even though what we receive first from the world is simple ideas, and only later do we make complex ideas, nevertheless, the most abstract ideas like red come last of all, because we got the simple idea of red right away, but it was mixed in with all the other ideas and couldn't be used to stand for others of the same nature or anything like that. First, it had to be separated out, put into a complex idea, abstracted, and now we have the same simple idea of red, but seen for what it is, this one simple idea that many different things could have caused in us, and that's the abstract idea. Okay, so that's all I have time for today. I will see you, those who can join me at this time tomorrow. And if not, you should be able to watch the recording. Okay, bye. Yet.